Money. Everything is money. It's always about money. What life decisions we make. What our living conditions are like. How we feel. Wars are fought because of money. People love each other because of money. People hate each other because of money. And at the same time, we don't have a clue what money actually is. I already made a video about money in 2021 during the COVID pandemic, on which this one is based, and from which this one will be a very extensive update. So recap. The corona pandemic. Millions of people die, become chronically ill. The entire globe is completely overwhelmed. We lock ourselves in our homes, isolate ourselves. A whole generation spends a large part of their childhood or youth exclusively on the internet. There's a huge crypto, blockchain, NFT hype. The AI revolution took off with ChatGPT. And the insanity of the post-COVID world with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Israel's genocide in Gaza, Donald Trump's comeback as US president, etc. certainly has a lot to do with the COVID time that we all have suppressed from our minds today.
The year 2020 is actually a time in history that the entire US government, the mainstream media, and pretty much everyone in power has spent billions and billions of dollars waging a massive propaganda war to try to make you forget. And that propaganda campaign has worked on a lot of you, because the period in time that most of America has memory hold was actually pretty revolutionary. In the early months of spring 2020, when COVID began to spread, the U.S. witnessed a momentary glimpse into a more equitable society. The entire U.S. government was taking care of its people in ways that it hadn't before. Policies that we were always told were absolutely impossible in America suddenly came to fruition. I want to go through a few notable ones. There was the CARES Act, enacted in March 2020, which provided direct financial assistance to struggling workers by extending unemployment benefits and offering an additional $600 per week. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which also passed in 2020, mandated paid sick leave and increased funding for food assistance programs, lifting countless people out of poverty. On a state level in 2020, states like New Mexico began offering free childcare, a policy that lifted approximately 120,000 people above the poverty line. The state even began taking budget surplus directly from oil and gas revenue to fund early childhood education. Other states, including Connecticut, implemented universal free school meal programs, ensuring that all students had access to hot, nutritious meals, regardless of income, for the first time. These policies and dozens more resulted in a significant reduction of food insecurity across America. In 2020, SNAP benefits were increased and helped feed over 15 million young people. From 2020 to 2021, the expansion of food programs across the U.S. resulted in 2.4 million households no longer being food insecure. Millions were also suddenly able to get health care in 2020. The government made it easier than ever to enroll in Medicare and Medicaid, which resulted in millions of people who had been previously unable to afford health insurance suddenly able to get care. The government invested $145 million in expanding telehealth services, meaning millions of disabled and housebound people could finally access care, some for the first time in decades. In 2020, housing insecurity plummeted thanks to federal policies like the Treasury Department's ERA program, which provided over $46 billion to support housing stability for renters. There was a nationwide eviction moratorium, and the government rolled out a suite of tenant protections. California, actually, where I live, helped thousands of previously unhoused people gain access to permanent housing. I don't want to go on too much, but these are just a sliver of the policies that we saw the government enact during the early days of the pandemic, and they showed everyone in America, for the first time ever, what was actually possible if we allocated just a fraction of the billions and billions of dollars that we spend on the military and things like tax cuts for the rich towards the public good.
As Taylor Lorenz says here in relation to the USA, but what we can also transfer to the rest of at least the Western world, is that we have forgotten that things were suddenly politically possible, that were previously unthinkable, which is also where my original video about money came from. Money was suddenly available in abundance. Corona aid was paid out. There was virtually unconditional cultural funding. A spectrum of possibilities opened up, that another world was possible. If we look at today, 2025, all of this has evaporated. On the contrary, the wind has turned 180 degrees. The political creed everywhere is, we have to save, cut back, doge, disruption, chainsaw.
This is the chainsaw for bureaucracy. Chainsaw!
Culture? Gone. Social benefits? Gone. Education? No more. The only place where there is an abundance of money today, where there is no talk about saving money, doge, disruption and all this stuff, is for the military. But that's not what I want to talk about here. But why do they, our political leaders and the major media, want us to forget the glimmer of hope of the otherwise terrible corona period? The only answer I can assume is neoliberalism, which the policies of the corona period said goodbye to. But obviously our political system didn't want to say goodbye to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, which has been up to mischief for the last 30 to 40 years by undermining democracy, education and culture, and has therefore played a major role in the direction which we are currently developing, is currently entering its next evolutionary stage towards libertarianism, which, if not finally something is happening to stop this unholy development, will lead us all directly into something we don't want to imagine. In fact, we are already, depending on where you live, almost completely or halfway there. I don't want to give this something a name, because partially it resembles things from the past, and partially it's something completely new. And, of course, we can't look into the future, so we don't know exactly what it could be. But at least the US seems to develop into a kind of libertarian authoritarian tech oligarchy, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, thanks for hosting this, and this is quite a group to get together. And
thank you for incredible leadership, including getting this group together.
I want to thank you for including me this evening. It's incredible to be among everyone here, particularly you and the First Lady.
Thank you so much for getting us all together, and thank you for being such a pro-business, pro-innovation president. It's a very refreshing change.
But, like I just said, right now it's not clear as to what exactly it could turn out to be. The libertarianism that we see erupting in extremes in the US under Donald Trump with his combination of MAGA Nazis and tech Nazis, and in Argentina under Javier Milei, is also taking place in a more condensed form in the rest of the Western world. Even if there is a superficial dissociation from Trumpist policies, in reality the same shit is being pulled off. Cutting costs everywhere, at the expense of people with little money. Education, culture. All things that are essential for a working democracy. And all of this combined with blatant racism. What we are seeing right now is libertarianism forming an unholy alliance with neo-fascism. If you look at the publications of libertarian gurus, such as Curtis Yarvin or Alex Karp from Palantir, for example. So what is libertarianism? Libertarianism wants to abolish the state, but not in an anarchist way, even though those people are calling themselves also anarcho-capitalists. Instead, in dystopian cyberpunk fashion, they want the world to be ruled by big companies, resembling an oligarchy. The fewer companies there are, the better. And they want money to no longer be controlled by central banks, but, according to the narrative, for money to function decentrally, and thus not to be controlled by anyone. Of course, this narrative of decentralization is only there for hiding the actual goal. Decentralized cryptocurrencies, for example, are controlled by those who own the most of them, and who can build the biggest computing farms, aka the super rich. And by being uncontrollable by central banks, money is deprived of any democratic control. When crypto or AI bros talk about democratization of something, they mean de-democratization. And in the most radicalized version of today's libertarianism, they also dream of ethno-nationalist authoritarian states, white supremacy, etc. See the aforementioned Curtis Yarvin or Alex Karp. I've already used the term evolution, because in my view this development is a logical, almost inevitable one, if it's not broken by other forces, like functioning politics, or people's movements. So, how does this evolution look like? Capitalism developed from feudalism. But I'll leave feudalism out for now and come back to it in a moment. Following from the crude industrial capitalism of the 19th century, and in between the fascism in the 20th century, capitalism developed into various kinds of welfare capitalism. The welfare state was introduced in rudimentary form before fascism, but after World War II, it was the defining image of capitalism in stronger and weaker forms. In the welfare state, capitalist exploitation still takes place internally, but is mitigated by the welfare state, where you get unemployment money, public health care, unions are important to fight for workers' rights, and so on. Where the exploitation was really happening, without or much less mitigation, was on the outside, profiting from the structure of the post-colonial world. And that was of course not a problem for anyone. It was more like a natural law of competition between states. The other exploited states just could establish their own welfare systems, right? And so there was profit, growth, Wirtschaftswunder. Then, since the 1980s, neoliberalism has slowly taken hold. The greed of the elites is overflowing. They want more. The welfare state must be reduced to a minimum. Why should companies pay taxes when they can get more profit without paying taxes? Why should they fund useless culture when they can make more beautiful profit? Ignoring the fact that all of the stuff made capitalism so successful, and abolishing it would and will ultimately lead to its death. The logical conclusion? Libertarianism. The welfare state must go. And while we're at it, we no longer need democracy as we know it either. No protection of minorities, no culture, and education only to generate productive labor. Real education is for losers, and the humanities we no longer need at all. And this leads to the dangerous situation we are in now. And where the whole thing is heading to is a kind of neo or tech feudalism, where the super rich are the new lords who virtually own people, for example in the gig economy, who have no control over their working conditions and are sent around by an app. In tech feudalism, we no longer own anything. We rent everything, pay subscriptions, or are bombarded with advertising. Everything belongs to a few billionaires, who control and monitor all areas of life, and are reshaping the world according to their vision, which they believe is better than what a democracy could ever achieve. It should be clear to everyone that this cannot be the solution. And, as I said at the beginning, it's always about money. So if we want an alternative to this future scenario, we have to talk about money. And it should be clear to everyone that we won't get anywhere continuing with neoliberal culture wars. We need to understand what money is, how it works and how it changes. Because money is not a fixed entity, it is what we make of it. And to claim that it is a clearly defined fixed construct leads to the situation we are in today. And during the COVID pandemic, we already had a glimpse that things could be different. So let's get into it. The evolution of capitalism. So, capitalism. What is it? Seems like a stupid question, because we all think it's just how our world works. And most think it can only be how the world works, and it needs to be improved in itself. But is it? Because capitalism is not a natural law. In fact, capitalism is not that old. As said before, the thing that capitalism replaced was feudalism. And what we know as capitalism today emerged in England during the Industrial Revolution between the 18th and 19th century. So what was feudalism? This is an important question, because right now, as just mentioned, we are going back to a model that is similar to feudalism, which shows that capitalism can replace something and can be replaced by something. And we are at a point in time where it is essential to ask by what it should be replaced. So, what was feudalism? Feudalism was in many aspects similar to capitalism, and capitalism a continuation of feudalism, meaning that there was no breaking point, no radical system shift, but more of a very slow fade between the 14th and 19th century. In feudalism, in short, the main currency was not money, but land. Land was owned by the lords and granted to vassals, in exchange for service, both in the form of military service and in giving a portion of their produce to the lords. The vassals were not slaves, as they were not property of the lord. But because they had no own property, the dependency to the lord was huge and the power structures clear and almost unchangeable. In capitalism this changed. Whoop whoop! Capitalism made it possible for other groups of the population to gain wealth, but the noble people, with all their properties, had the best chances to do so, and so to become capitalists. So, what is capitalism? Capitalism. Here we come to Karl Marx's theory about money and capitalism. Marx describes the shift from feudalism to capitalism as the idea of money has shifted. In feudalism, money existed, as it already existed for thousands of years, but didn't play such an important role, since the social relation was mostly a direct one between the vassal and the lord. Then trade between towns was growing, and money became more important due to the indirect nature of trade. So you needed money as a medium of exchange for commodities. And then the Industrial Revolution happened, which changed everything. Now we had the ability to produce stuff infinitely more efficiently than before. But for producing the stuff, you needed many people working in factories operating the machines. So in this new industrial capitalism, money developed to not just being a medium, but also capital. Money is not just there to exchange goods, but also to make more money, profit. And so, as Marx says, also labor became a commodity. And money became the driving force of production, not just a tool, what was to transform the entire economic and social order. And the ideal image of money in terms of capitalism works like this. A company manufactures a product. To do this, the company hires workers. These workers provide their lifetime and life energy to work in a factory. In return, the workers receive a salary. The manufactured product is sold. The buyers of the product are in turn workers. They can buy the product with the money they have earned from their work. Ideally, this creates a money cycle. However, a large part of the money earned from the sale goes as profit to the company that employs the workers, to the capitalist. This means, of course, that the cycle is not fully functioning, because more and more money is being siphoned off. This is where the ideology of growth exists in capitalism. This growth can be achieved by technological progress, more efficiency and automation. So with the same amount of work, more value can be created. And so, more money. And so the money siphoned off is balanced out by more value being created. And so, money put into the money cycle again. One problem is that the increased production does not benefit people, but the capitalist. As Marx points out, more and more is being produced through industrialization, but people don't have to work less. And so the exploitation of the workers doesn't become less, the capitalist just gets more money. You could make the counter-argument that in the past 100 years industrial capitalism produced a lot of additional wealth, at least in some countries. And if you look back at the stock markets, there was, besides some crashes, only one general direction: up. But to the stock markets I will come back later. And we also have to see that, despite all the euphoria of growth, fact is, inequality is rising, locally and globally. Marx saw capitalism as a step towards communism, as it would build the basis on which communism could work. Because with a more and more productive industry, at some point there would be an abundance of produced goods, leading to a crisis of overproduction, which would develop the material conditions for communism, where production is controlled by the people and things can be produced according to the needs of the people. But until now, this obviously didn't happen. Capitalism is still thriving and prospering in its destructive way, but with the latest developments in the world, especially the digital revolution and political developments towards neofascism, he may end up being right after all, at least with the idea that capitalism destroys itself. Central banks. The production of money, part 1. But still, where does the money come from? Because it doesn't just appear automatically when a product is manufactured and value is created as just described. Where does the money come from with which people buy the product and the workers are paid? There are two essential mechanisms for generating money. Both are linked to debt, or credits. But it is very important to recognize that they are fundamentally different mechanisms, even though today's politics want to make us believe they are the same. One mechanism for generating money is private loans from banks, which I will come to later. The other mechanism to create money, which became more and more important in recent years, is loans taken out by governments from their central banks. Central banks such as the Federal Reserve System, or Fed for short, in the US, or the ECB, the European Central Bank in the Eurozone, are there to produce the money in physical and virtual form that we all use, with which people are paid for their work and with which the value created by a product is measured. But how does this money enter circulation? Through loans that governments take out from their central banks. Nowadays, at least in the Eurozone, this usually works through government bonds, which in turn involves private banks. I want to exclude the government bonds here and simplify it to the government takes loans from central banks, as it is systemically the same, only without the involvement of private banks. These loans from central banks to states are not really loans, as the central banks have no interest in demanding repayment of this borrowed money. What central banks are demanding back is interest rates, in order to control inflation. But the fundamental purpose of these so-called loans is not to be repaid. Rather, the opposite is true. These loans are the mechanism by which these money factories put the money they produce into circulation. All the money we hold in our hands and have in our accounts, if it's not from private loans, is ultimately money borrowed from central banks. This is where the endless discussion about how much debt a country should be allowed to take on in terms of intergenerational justice, since this money will have to be repaid at some point, misses the point. This money never has to be repaid. The only danger in taking on government debt, which is basically printing money, is that too much money is in circulation, causing inflation to rise. But the question here is where the money goes to, and thus where inflation occurs. But I will come back to that later. Service economy. The mechanism of the creation of value I described here is about industrial capitalism, which Karl Marx's analysis of capitalism is based on. And while industrial capitalism is still very important, and in fact the driving force that keeps capitalism running, other forms of capitalism have always existed, but got more and more important. Because how people make money is not only by working in a factory and producing goods, but also by offering immaterial services, such as financial services, retail, culture or education. So, in the so-called developed countries, there has been talk for decades that they would transform into service societies. Terms such as information capitalism are being used, as industry has largely been outsourced to low-wage countries, and most people in so-called developed countries would work in the service sector. They are not involved in the production of physical goods, but offer intangible services. However, industry still plays a major role in so-called developed countries. And, regarding the outsourcing of production, the countries that profited from outsourcing the last decades now face big trouble due to rising international conflicts and their dependencies to the outsourced industries, especially in China. And one thing that Marx couldn't think of in today's dimensions is the production of another kind of goods that was before only in the realm of arts, in the form of books, music or films. Virtual goods. A thing that has to be created one time and then can be replicated infinitely. With the digital revolution, virtual goods in the form of software and internet services became one main product category in modern capitalism. Digital production. Since modern computers emerged, it was suddenly possible to sell one product on a massive scale without manufacturing it every single time in a factory. You needed to put the effort of coding the software one time, and then you could reproduce it endlessly. First on a physical data carrier, like a floppy disk or a CD-ROM, then with the internet, just as a download link. And, as a next step, not even as a download, but just as a web service that runs in your browser. That made those new companies immediately the most profitable companies in the world, next to oil companies. Because other than those old-school industrial companies, they don't need factories, no workers for every single product sold. They still need workers for coding and maintaining the software with updates. And they need some server infrastructure. But this is no comparison to manufacturing a product every single time. So in our increasingly digitized and automated world, in the logic of industrial capitalism, an imbalance is emerging, even if we would assume its ideal form. In the virtual world of software and the internet, neither labor nor physical materials are needed to reproduce goods and provide services. Once written, one code can be reproduced infinitely. And this concept of selling ideas instead of physical products, ironically, was also translated to physical products manufactured in factories. This I want to show with Apple as a perfect example. However, this can be applied to many companies that have outsourced their production, but Apple has by far the largest profit margin. Apple is one of the most valuable and most profitable companies in the world that sells millions of physical products and makes billions of dollars. And they have never run their own factories, have never hired their own factory workers. Obviously, those physical products get manufactured somewhere, by factory workers. In fact, quite a lot of people. According to Patrick McGee in his book Apple in China, at peak times, 1.7 million people at the same time work in China to put Apple products together. A total of unbelievable 27 million people in China have already been trained to assemble Apple products. But they didn't and don't work for Apple. They work for companies specialized in manufacturing, of which Foxconn is the largest. If you compare those 1.7 million workers to the 160,000 people directly employed by Apple, of which only 15,000 highly paid people work at the Apple headquarters in Cupertino, and then you look at the distribution of money, here with the example of the iPhone 4S, it should become clear what happens here. The money you spend for an iPhone goes for the most part to the designers and coders at Apple, and not to the people who bring each individual product to life. In the example of the iPhone 4S, of the $630, only 2%, $15, go to the manufacturing company. That also keeps some profit for themselves, of course. So almost nothing arrives at the factory workers, who are, as pointed out, 10 to 100 as many as the workers at Apple. On the other side, more than 50%, $319 of the $330 go directly to Apple. And here we are not even at the layer below with the extraction of raw materials and even worse working conditions here. So Apple, despite officially being a hardware company, also belongs to the new world of companies selling virtual goods, who are therefore endlessly more profitable as companies in the world of industrial capitalism, producing physical goods. So we have two worlds here, where money has different values: the material and the virtual world. This leads to a situation where, in a world based on profit maximization in the physical economy, with large amounts of exploitative labor in so-called low-wage countries, at every level, from the extraction of raw materials, to the manufacture of the product, to the distribution and sale of the products, every cent is fought over, while in the immaterial economy, money is available in abundance. In the case of physical goods, in addition to the value-added tax, which ideally also applies to the sale of digital goods, the proceeds from the sale of the product must be distributed among many parties. Some parties ultimately receive only cent amounts, which mainly affects the so-called low-wage countries, where the raw materials are extracted and the products are assembled. The majority of the profit, in turn, goes to the company whose brand name appears on the product. In this way, also those hardware companies free themselves from the burdensome limitations of physical reality by transferring this burden to other parties, thereby gaining an insurmountable advantage over them, which provides them with virtually unlimited financial resources and, as a result, power. So here too, similar to software, a company only produces a virtual idea that is materialized by others. However, most of the money goes to the creator of the idea. There is therefore also a direct relationship of exploitation between the material and the immaterial economies. And that's why those tech companies have those unbelievable profit margins that separates them from almost any other industry that is much more dependent on the material world. Google. Advertising in capitalism and the logistics of free online services. One other important aspect is the interdependence between online advertising and online retail. Advertising was always an essential part of capitalism, because capitalism can only function through advertising. Because when different companies offer virtually the same product with similar quality, it can only be differentiated through a brand image, attention, constructed popularity. But in the digital world, this has become immensely important. You can almost say perverted. If you look at Google as the world's biggest advertising company, and also one of the most, if not the most profitable company in the world, mostly because of their advertising business. The advertising economy adds another huge layer to capitalism, especially in today's digital economy. In our digitalized world, we now have the phenomenon that virtually all the internet services we use are financed by advertising. Advertising that wants and makes us to buy products. YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and all the others are financed by us. They are financed by us buying products advertised on their sites. And these products are usually physical products that come from factories where workers have manufactured them on production lines. The entire digital world, in which so much money is at stake and which has made some people extremely wealthy, is therefore directly dependent on the industrial production of consumer goods. In other words, the shopping addiction of our time, the billions of packages of fast fashion and other junk that are shipped around the world every day, finance the Googles, Facebooks and TikToks that would otherwise not be able to survive, unless they are infused with venture capital, which is just a short-term solution though. So there is another direct relationship of dependency between these two worlds, digital and industrial production. Surveillance capitalism. Money as data. There is also always the argument that you pay for those services with your data, and that's why they are for free, because those companies then sell your data. I would argue that this is not how it works, most of the time at least, because, as just said, they obviously make their money with advertising that makes you buy things. But still, data is another important aspect of the new digital world. The abundance of data those companies collect can be translated to money, can be translated to power. The more data you have, the better advertisements you can direct to the people. The better you can suggest content, but also propaganda to people. The better you can train your AIs. The more you can understand and control people. This is both interesting for companies and for states. social networks especially have such an amount of data that they can create very sophisticated personality profiles of us, which they can use to target us with the perfect advertisements for products we might want to buy. And Google, on the other side, shows ads on almost every website on the internet and can therefore see what kind of websites we visit, what we are interested in. If you don't use their browser Google Chrome, then they know your whole browser history. Perfect. And don't forget about cookies of various companies, which have contracts with all the websites you use to save a cookie in your browser when you use their website, that they can track you all over the internet. Also, they are creating profiles of you for targeted advertising or some shady stuff we don't know about. And of course, with smart glasses and autonomous cars and already conventional cars with cameras everywhere, and delivery robots and drones and whatnot that are filming your surroundings non-stop and make it possible to create thousands of data points of your behavior and of all the other people who get into the camera frames of these devices, your friends and family, but also random people on the streets, this digital surveillance capitalism also advances into the physical world. And advertising is only one aspect all this data is useful for. Another one is much more disturbing, I think. This data is also being used for surveillance by private companies, or states, or the combination of the two. One famous example for this is the state of China, where everyone's behavior on the internet can be tracked by the state. But also in the West there is one private company that was hugely funded by the CIA after 9/11, Palantir. It was founded by the longtime Trump supporter and inventor of JD Vance, Peter Thiel, and aforementioned Alex Karp. By combining data from social networks and general information about individuals from the internet, and probably also from dubious sources unknown to the public, and most likely illegal in origin, with police data, government databases, data from tax offices, data from health authorities, and God knows where else, Palantir has a surveillance infrastructure that can be used for all kinds of things, and can be booked by states or corporate clients, who in turn can feed their own data into the system, which in turn provides Palantir with new valuable data, making it even more powerful. Right now, already numerous armies and polices of various states are using Palantir services.
Unser Produkt kann zum Töten von Menschen eingesetzt werden.
Geht es um Zielbestimmung für Drohnen?
Um jede Art von Zielbestimmung. Wenn Sie irgendwo auf der Welt einen Terroristen suchen, nutzen Sie dafür wahrscheinlich unser Regierungsprodukt. Und um die Person auszuschalten, nutzen Sie vermutlich ebenfalls ein Produkt von uns.
So ICE, the Gestapo-style anti-immigration police in the USA, are using Palantir to find undocumented people to deport them. Israel's army IDF is using their software to kill people in Gaza. And with Doge under Donald Trump and his formerly best friend Elon Musk, Palantir got virtually every information the state has about their citizens. And police forces all around the world are using Palantir to predict crime or to find potential terrorists, giving data to a private company while paying for a service that is deeply morally questionable. Should a private company have this much information, that much power? But let's go back to the main topic of this film, money and capitalism. Rent capitalism. Neofeudalism. There is no property anymore. One fundamental aspect of capitalism has always been property. Private property is seen as a major achievement of capitalism over feudalism. If you have money, you can buy something, and then you own it. But private property is also becoming a relic of the past in today's world. Which is why, as mentioned at the beginning, there is talk of us developing into a form of neofeudalism. When it comes to housing, it has always been normal for a large part of society to rent rather than own their homes and pay rent to your landlords. But even this proportion is growing, with fewer and fewer people living in their own four walls. But property is also becoming less and less relevant in the rest of the market. We have subscriptions for software and streaming services. If you cancel the subscription, you can no longer use the software, listen to the music or watch the movies. However, other aspects of the rent economy are quite useful. Take cars, for example. Cities are jam-packed with cars because all car owners have their own car. In a shared economy, many people can use the same car, which, in the case of autonomous cars, even drives to you by itself. The auto industry doesn't think this is a good idea though, because it would mean they could only sell a fraction of the cars they do now. So our politics, sponsored by your local car manufacturer, will prevent this until the local car industry has finally gone under, which is better to happen sooner rather than later, giving us the chance to live in cities that aren't a desert of metal and electronic waste. But back to neofeudalism. As described before, in feudalism, power and land were concentrated in the hands of a few nobles. Today's tech billionaires like Musk, Bezos or Zuckerberg are in control of massive platforms, infrastructure and data. These platforms, social media, AI, cloud services, are like digital fiefdoms, and we depend on them much like serfs depended on the land. When we look at those new structures in rent capitalism, where you rent software, for example, instead of buying it one time and owning it, being able to use it forever, we can see that an even greater divide opens up between two worlds, in which money has very different values. When you have to pay again and again every month for a product that can be reproduced infinitely, like Adobe's products or Microsoft Office, while physical products, whose manufacturer requires labor and material each time, are usually on forever. If you disregard planned obsolescence, of course, which is another issue altogether. But this also plays a major role, as companies like Apple design their products in such a way that when, for example, the battery in their products die, it is virtually impossible to replace it, and most people simply dispose the product and buy a new one, even though the old one would still work for years with a new battery. Something that was completely normal not so long ago, such as replacing batteries, or unscrewing devices and replacing defective parts, is now virtually unimaginable. But the EU has decided that this should be simplified again, so let's see where this goes. But that's not all. There's a second area, in which there is a major conflict between monetary values. But to explain this, I need to take a step back, with the realization that a significant change in the nature of money took place much earlier. Fiat money. The production of money, Part 2. Until the 70s, the concept of money was that there was only a limited amount of money, whose value was largely linked to gold. In addition, banks were not allowed to lend out all the money they managed, but had to hold back reserves as security. This made sense, as it prevented too much money from being on the market, and thus the value of money from falling. But already in the 70s, the link between money and gold was abolished, and credit lending began to be deregulated, and security reserves for loans were massively reduced. With the abolition of the gold standard for the US dollar on August 15, 1971, money was no longer backed by physical assets. This new form of money is called fiat money, from the Latin word fiat, meaning let there be. From then on, banks were able to lend almost all of the money in an account to another person as credit. This leads to a debt spiral, because the money that the bank lends is back in another account and can be lent out again to a large extent. Each of these lending processes is a de facto doubling of money, and this process continues uninterrupted. This means that today, most of the money in the world is debt-based in some form, even aside from the so-called debts from central banks, which are not really debts, because they do not have to be repaid. This cannot be really measured due to the ephemeral nature of money as a construct. Of course, the mechanisms of value creation through production and labor still exists, and raw materials such as oil also play a huge role. But there is no denying that the infinite money creation through private loans described here plays an enormous role in how much money is in circulation. However, this field is so complex that there is no consensus among economists, and the respective points of view are strongly ideological. Ultimately, all this means that money no longer has any counter value. Money today is purely virtual. It is theoretically unlimited. This also explains how the massive cash injections by central banks during the 2008 banking crisis, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and now with the release of government debt into literally infinite military spending are possible. Finance capitalism. Fictional money. Okay, now there was a lot of talk about money without talking about the elephant in the room. One main reason why two worlds of money have opened up. Also besides, but closely connected, to the two worlds of virtual and physical production, where money has a different value. Finance capitalism. While Marx's analysis of capitalism was based on industrial capitalism, the term finance capitalism was already coined in 1910 by the Marxist theorist Rudolf Hilferding. Already back then there was a growth of banks and investors, causing the phenomenon I will describe in a second. But first, World War II happened. And after World War II, industrial capitalism was ruling again, until the 80s. And then, neoliberalism kicked in. Connected to the virtualization of money, the creation of fiat money, making money from now on an endless entity, neoliberal politics privatized as many state-owned companies as they could, making them buyable via stocks on the stock market, while at the same time deregulating the financial markets a lot. This made the stock market being its own huge economy, its own form of capitalism. It works like this. A company can raise money by selling parts of itself publicly on the stock market, or privately, what happens with the big AI companies nowadays. so people can buy shares of companies in the form of stocks. They do this in the hope that the value of the stock will rise, and they will be able to sell the shares later at a higher price. Shares are traded on various stock exchanges around the world, and the greater the interest in a share, the more expensive it becomes, in accordance with the rules of supply and demand. Conversely, if many people want to sell a company's shares, for example because it is in crisis, or a scandal has occurred, and there are too few people interested in buying the shares, the price falls to a level where people are interested in buying the shares again. Or it crashes completely, resulting in the company being worth nothing, and people having invested in the company losing all the money they invested in the company, if they haven't sold their stocks on time, to other people, who then own the later worthless stocks. So, the money is not lost, or burned, as people say. The money is at the people who sold their stocks to the people who now own a worthless stock. And those who sell their stocks on time are not the average traders next door. Those are those who know, politicians for example, with secret knowledge about things, which shows the potential of finance capitalism easily corrupting politics, even without the influence of lobbyists. Such a crash famously happened with the dot-com bubble crash in the year 2000, and probably will soon again with the AI bubble, which I will come to later. In theory, investors invest into companies according to their profits, and so the net worth of the company should somehow relate to the profit a company makes. And because companies producing virtual goods have an insurmountable benefit over companies producing physical goods in terms of making profit, people are also much more interested in buying those kinds of stocks against stocks of traditional companies. And so, their stock prices are exploding. Since there is no direct connection between the stock market and the real economy, but only an indirect one, through the investors buying stocks in the stock market in a highly emotional and speculative atmosphere. And suddenly, companies are multiple times as valuable as their profit is. Or, even more absurd, they lose billions of dollars every year, but still are valued hundreds of billions of dollars. And this can only happen, because this fake economy became the main economy of our times. Almost all the money generated in the old school way, in industrial capitalism, and/or by newly printed money by central banks, ends up in the finance world, and is therefore missing in the real world, making the disbalance between the material world and the real world bigger and bigger. Inflation. In the past years, since I made the original video, a massive inflation has occurred, seemingly proving me wrong in my assumption that the massive government spending during the pandemic wouldn't cause a significant inflation, other than the cantillon effect I'm coming to in a moment. But was the government spending the main reason for the inflation in the last years? We can't know for sure, but very certainly there are other main reasons combined together that caused the inflation that make more sense. Firstly, by far the strongest price driver was the explosion in energy costs. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and the ensuing sanctions, cheap Russian gas and oil supplies were lost, and since gas is often used to generate electricity, electricity prices also rose massively. This made the production of almost all goods more expensive. Secondly, the pandemic threw the global economy off balance. Factories were closed, especially in China, and a shortage of containers led to a global shortage of intermediate products like microchips and construction materials. Also, food became significantly more expensive, driven by the consequences of the war. The war hampered exports of grain, sunflower oil and fertilizers, making almost everything more expensive. And if this all would not be enough, also climate change comes into play here. Droughts and poor harvests further reduced the supply of fruits and vegetables. And finally, we unfortunately can observe the so-called greedflation. Many companies just raised prices more than their own increased costs would have justified. In the general chaos of price increases, these companies took the opportunity to expand their profit margins, as customers expected higher prices anyway, and were more likely to accept them. So, with all those additional reasons that explain the inflation of the last years very clearly, you can assume that the massive government spending during the pandemic wasn't the main factor causing the inflation. But besides the inflation in the real world I just described, there is another kind of inflation happening that is not so obvious to see, because it doesn't affect our daily lives directly, like the cost of living inflation, but indirectly has a huge effect on everything. The cantillon effect. Because inflation occurs not everywhere in the same strength, which is why it is also very difficult to determine inflation generally. And inflation that isn't caused by an external factor, like a war or a pandemic, but by too much money being in circulation, happens primarily where most of the money ends up. And where a major part of the money in our world of finance capitalism ends up, also the money from government spendings, is the stock and the real estate markets. And there we are seeing an inflation happening independent from the factors I described before. Especially the stock markets are exploding, even though the rest of the economies are mostly stagnating. What we are seeing here is a partial inflation, also known as the cantillon effect. An inflation that does not occur everywhere at once, but only in parts of the economy. And because so much money ends up in the stock market, there a kind of hyperinflation is happening, that is actually much higher than the already very high cost of living inflation in the real world. And that also private people and even states put their money into the stock market, redistributing money from the real world to the finance world, heats up this inflation even more. Because if you want to invest money, you invest it where it can grow the most, namely in the stock and real estate markets. This makes the people who are able to invest money even richer, while the rest of the world sees the opposite effect. In addition to the stock market, this partial inflation is causing the rental and real estate markets to skyrocket, redistributing even more money to the top. And it explains the absurdly overvalued companies, some of which have never made a profit and are worth billions. Also, the real estate market is a perfect money-making machine. With almost no effort, you can generate money virtually forever from people who need a place to live. Meanwhile, the value of the building also rises continuously, because so much money flows into the real estate market that partial inflation occurs. This is why many buildings and flats in cities simply stand empty and serve only as investments, without having to deal with troublesome tenants. The newly printed money ends up with people who can afford to invest it. And, of course, they invest it in areas where there is the greatest chance of seeing a return. This results in partial inflation that never, or only later, affects the rest of the world. However, the fact that it is not yet happening in the rest of the world does not mean that it has no consequences in the rest of the world, in the real world. The most direct consequence is the explosion of rental prices, which affects virtually everyone. But inflation in the stock market also has significant consequences. The money that has been withdrawn from the real world is, of course, missing there, and, due to inflation, is now worth much less on the stock market. In the rest of the world, however, it is still worth as much as before. The billions of eurodollars that are worth a few cents in the stock market are still worth billions of eurodollars in the real world. And this leads to an enormous power imbalance between these worlds. Especially since the real world, apart from the financial dimensions, is actually the much larger one. The one that affects many more people. Or rather, all people. A power imbalance that is getting bigger and bigger, and seems increasingly difficult to reverse. So today we have the weird situation that two kinds of capitalism exist at the same time. Finance capitalism is extremely powerful, but purely fictional. It relies on, or is a layer on top of global industrial capitalism, with all its companies, factories, workers, which all still works in old-school industrial capitalist logic, with the twist that almost all of those companies also are part of, and therefore in control of, the stock market, with its financial capitalist logic. In an ideal capitalist world, this would seamlessly work together. Stock prices would rise according to the success of the company. But in reality, the reality of finance capitalism is only very partially connected to industrial capitalism. In today's world, it is normal to look at stock prices when considering the state of the economy. If they are rising, everything is great. If they are falling, we have a problem. But, as it is repeated over and over again like a prayer, even if things go down sometimes, in the long run, they always go up. Hold the stocks. However, while there is certainly a correlation between rising stock prices and economic growth, these two curves should not be equated. This should be particularly clear today, when we can observe the phenomenon that the economy is doing badly because people have too little money to consume, but the stock markets are jumping from all-time high to all-time high, because all the money that people are lacking ends up there, and we can see an almost complete decoupling of the real market and the financial market. But of course, stock prices benefit from companies announcing profits, as shareholders are then more likely to buy their shares, making them more valuable. But stock prices also benefit from speculation about the future. This company could soon go through the roof. And speculation is speculation, which means that the prediction could also be wrong. And so there are companies, primarily in the tech sector, currently especially in the AI sector, in which venture capitalists are investing billions of dollars in the hope that a few of them will deliver huge profits in 10 to 20 years. These companies now have a market capitalization of unimaginable proportions, even though they don't even sell a product yet. By the way, one nasty trick of venture capitalism is that they use billions of dollars to disrupt an existing market with a cheap product at a loss, until the existing market is destroyed, and they can use the monopoly they have created to offer their cheap, poor quality product at high prices, under exploitative conditions, which is also a consequence of neoliberal deregulation. Regarding financial capitalism, we should also stop referring to someone like Elon Musk as the richest man in the world, or at least put his wealth into perspective. The $400 billion, or whatever he owns, is fictitious. If he were to start converting the shares that make up this value into real money on a large scale, the share price would collapse and his net worth would immediately decline. The market capitalization of companies is a fictitious value that extrapolates the current purchase value of one share to all shares, which is an invalid calculation, because if all shares were sold at once, the price would collapse and the shares would be worthless. With the only exception if one person or company buys another company at once. Then they sometimes even pay more than the market capitalization of one company, so that current shareholders agree to sell their stocks. But selling all or a huge amount of the stocks of one company in the free market at once would most likely lead to a crash of the stock. And it gets even crazier. Billionaires don't use their stock money to buy a company, for example. They take debt for that. Which they can because they are infinitely rich, and so any bank would lend them infinite amounts of money. And they do that because, besides the risk of their company's stock price falling due to selling a big amount of them, paying interest rates is cheaper than the tax they would have to pay if they sell their stocks. They borrow money, aka fake money, to not use their own stock money, aka fake money. What a world. Modern monetary theory. The solution? As a result of these developments in the past decades of how money works, modern monetary theory, or MMT for short, has become increasingly popular in recent years. Since money is already completely abstract, MMT says, it no longer depends directly on Marx's idea that money/value is created by labor, so central banks and private banks can print almost as much money as they want, as long as it's their own currency and not a foreign one. The only barrier here is inflation, which must not be allowed to become too high. MMT says if governments use government debt in the right way to stimulate the economy, all the problems of states having too little money would be solved. We had enough money for infrastructure, education, social spendings and everything else, and everyone would be happy. MMT thus makes a clear statement against austerity policies and the idea that states should incur as little debt as possible. And MMT seems to be right. While mainstream economists worldwide are largely skeptical of MMT, in reality, the tide has long since turned. All major economic nations, with the exception of Germany, which continues to adhere to the debt brake to a large extent, are allowing their central banks to generate massive amounts of money, thereby approving enormous levels of government debt. Take Japan, the US, or China, for example. And this seems to be working without any major consequences. Of course, we can't say anything about the long-term consequences yet, as they lie in the future, but if the money printing is not completely exaggerated and hyperinflation is not generated, everything should actually go smoothly. So we can say that MMT is right about our current system. But is MMT the solution to our problems, as progressive economists claim? Let's take a look. While the modern monetary theory sounds appealing, it can only work in practice if the newly created money circulates in the real economy and stimulates productive activity. If government spendings flow primarily into sectors with limited economic spillover, such as the military, or it ends up directly in financial markets, which most of it certainly does, the effect on everyday economic life is small, and existing inequalities can even deepen, because the new money is then missing in the real world, and contrary, the disbalance between those worlds gets even higher. The new money created by central banks can lead to upward redistribution if it concentrates in the hand of asset owners, rather than boosting wages, public services or infrastructure. In theory, the capacity to create new money gives governments near infinite room for maneuver, allowing for instance massive investments in public transport or green energy. In reality, this monetary expansion mostly just functions as a workaround for a deeper systemic problem, replacing money that has been siphoned out of the economy and parked in private wealth holdings. So the billions of newly printed money for infrastructure and boosting the economy is actually just a stopgap solution, because so much money is being sucked out of the system into the parallel world of finance capitalism, and billionaires and trillionaires who don't let the money flow in the real world, but in this abstract parallel world, where it doesn't create value, but only more money that is actually not being newly created, but being sucked out of the real world, where then governments and central banks push more money into to keep the system running, until the money lands in the parallel world again, and so on and so on. So even if progressive economists nowadays promote the idea of printing money, and to some degree I think that's a good thing, I think the main problem we have is that so much money gets siphoned off the real world. And if this would be prevented, regulated in some form, redistributed, there would be enough money for everyone flowing around, and we wouldn't need to print so much new money. Still, I wouldn't disregard MMT completely, because as described before, the mechanisms of how money works have changed so much in the last century, got so abstracted and self-multiplying through credits and so on, that I don't think money just works as the creation of value by work as Marx described it anymore, even though, in my opinion, this is still one of the main factors of the creation of value of money. The interesting question is, with the fiat money we have today that enables this further abstraction of money as an endless entity and the insanity of finance capitalism and speculation, if we would somehow be able to revert that process and keep all or most of the money in the real world, would the fiat system still work? Probably some of the deregulation of credits would have to be reversed, and central banks would have to care a lot more about how much money they push into the system. Because ironically, there would be much more money flowing around, causing the risk of inflation, if not so much money would get siphoned off anymore. And then, the whole MMT idea would fall apart. But this is also just speculation from my side. In fact, no one really knows what would happen, due to the complexity of a global economic system. It would be an experiment, and things would have to be adjusted step by step, according to the circumstances. You know, just as normal politics work. And it would be worth trying it out. In my opinion, it's not necessary to have gold as a reserve or something. Money can be abstract and doesn't need an equivalent value. The big issue is that such an amount of money gets siphoned off to the few rich and to the finance market, and is therefore then missing in the real world. And, on a bigger scale, money gets siphoned off from the global south to the global north on global capitalism. So in the end, it's not so important if the idea of money has changed from the concept of money in times of industrial capitalism by Marx to the mixed neoliberal capitalism of today with fiat money, where the modern monetary theory makes a lot of sense. I mean, the idea of money clearly has changed, as this film should have shown. But the problems Marx described are still valid, as the fundamental mechanics of capitalism, if you exclude finance capitalism, are still in place. Workers work for big companies, and the owners, CEOs and stakeholders of those companies subtract a chunk of the profits for themselves. But also, MMT is right by saying that money today is not primarily generated anymore by work creating value, but by central banks and private banks, just printing it, in the best case according to the needs of the society. And with the developments in AI, automation and digitalization in mind, we need to think about how strongly the concept of work and the concept of money should be connected. That's why the next chapter is about work. As should have become clear by now, the concept of money is very closely linked to the concept of labor, which makes a lot of sense according to the Marxian idea of money. But if we look at the developments in finance capitalism, in the digital world, and in the increasingly automated industry, the question arises as to how much value is not created by human labor and how much money is generated without value creation, a product being created and sold, and how much value is created without or much less human labor. So, it is important to think about work. How is it connected to money and the distribution of money around the world? And how do we need to change the concept of work in reaction to those developments? Bullshit jobs. Because beside the fact that many, especially highly paid jobs in finance capitalism, already don't create value, see investment bankers, they even create the opposite, the loss of value, there is the term bullshit jobs that David Graeber coined in 2018. Up to 40% of workers in the Western world, and up to 25% globally, say their job made no meaningful contribution to the world. They just exist to be there, to manifest power structures or similar things. But the work they do doesn't create value. Not for them and not for the world. Only the economy profits, because money is flowing. But if those workers didn't work, but still get the same amount of money, the economy would still profit from it. If those people spending their lifetime in bullshit jobs would be happy about that, I would say that's cool. Because not everyone needs to create value to be a good human being. But the problem is that those people are not happy about that. They get sick and frustrated, feel meaningless. Fulfilling work. And that's why I think we should not differentiate between labor that creates value or not, but between labor that is fulfilling the people and work that is not. Because, just as Marx and Engels said in the German ideology, productive work makes a human, and I would agree to that. Work, whatever it is necessary for us humans to be fulfilled. So we don't need the capitalist pressure to be forced to work, we just do it on our own. The capitalist pressure is even counterproductive, as it makes us not want to work. So we possibly could build a system where people are free, where people can realize themselves in what they do. Because creating something, contributing something to society, whatever it is something that fulfills people, and at the same time creates real value. And I don't think that today's idea of self-fulfilling, self-realization, taking drugs, owning a big car, meditation, healthy lifestyle, etc. is really fulfilling for people. It's more like a symptom of not being fulfilled by what you are doing the rest of your time, I think. People should not be reduced to one job, and their self-realization happens in their free time. Or, as Marx and Engels said in this famous quote, "In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, it is possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman or critic." Although capitalism, especially in times of neoliberalism, has incorporated the concept of self-realization, this concept is completely at odds with that of communism. According to Byung-Chul Han, it is more a concept of self-exploitation that we euphemistically refer to as self-realization. We constantly strive to optimize ourselves, become more effective, achieve something, and tell ourselves that this will give us a feeling of freedom, but in the process we burn out completely and end up depressed. According to Han, this self-exploitation is a further development of the external exploitation of industrial capitalism and, of course, has nothing to do with the self-realization of communism, which does not see self-realization in neoliberal isolation, but rather as something that should be achieved within the framework of social solidarity. So we need to move away from work as a form of exploitation, both internal and external, and towards a concept of work that is not there to exploit us, but rather give people a sense of self-worth on the one hand, and to keep society running and progressing based on solidarity on the other. The fremdbestimmungsparadox, heteronomy. There's of course also the problem that autonomy is a difficult thing. We all know that being independent is hard. To decide things on your own is hard. That's why we love suggestion algorithms on music and video streaming platforms or on social media, for example. We often like to be fremdbestimmt, heteronymous. Someone says something to you, you do it. You get a reward. And that's totally okay. Deciding everything yourself in your life takes too much energy. No one can do that. And as long as you feel good while being fremdbestimmt, everything is fine. The problem begins when you don't feel good anymore, feel exploited, not valued, etc. As long as you have autonomy inside of heteronomy, everything is good. I even think that needing some heteronomy is an argument for my side. That people would work, even when they are not forced to do so by capitalist pressure. Because sometimes we all want to be a little bit fremdbestimmt. Shit jobs. And for those jobs that are considered as shit jobs today, that workers today only do because they are under capitalist pressure, we need to see if, first, are those jobs really needed? Or can they be replaced by something like AI, robots or whatever? Or being completely cut away? And second, if those today's shit jobs are really needed, how can we make them non-shit jobs? With better pay, better work conditions and social conditions, less work time, etc. And I'm pretty sure that that's possible, if we really want it to be so. And if we cut away the shit jobs that are not needed, and the bullshit jobs that are not needed, we have created a huge amount of workforce for the jobs that are needed and create value of any form. Material value, social value, value of self-realization. Which means that workers in those jobs, who are today overworked, underpaid, and getting sick and burned out because of that, are being equilibrated, can be paid more, have to work less, and once and for all can realize themselves in their jobs. Because people want to work, not should. AI will take away your job. The final stage of capitalism we are in, we can perfectly observe in the AI bubble. Unimaginable amounts of money are invested in a field where nobody knows what actually will come out of it that justify those huge investments. Which is why the Silicon Valley bosses are using the term AGI to justify why they need to raise, and are also investing themselves, so much money in it. AGI is essentially nothing other than God, which is a good justification if you believe they will create this AGI, this superpower, this God. Because if you can create God, any amount of money would be worth investing. But if you don't believe that those tech guys can create God with some graphics cards, you see how ridiculous this whole thing sounds. But back to reality, away from God. What in reality is the only thing that halfway makes sense to put so much money in is that this godly AGI can replace human labor in a scale that changes everything. And here we are again at Karl Marx Kapital. If it somehow would be possible to replace all or most workers with machines, capitalism wouldn't work anymore, because people wouldn't earn money anymore, and so couldn't buy anything. And while we're on the subject of robots and AI, more money is currently being pumped into this idea than ever before in anything in history. Which is crazy, because it's not even clear whether these investments will pay off in any way. That's why at the moment everyone is just waiting for this huge bubble to burst. And when the bubble bursts, we will first experience economic chaos that we can't even imagine yet. This will be particularly interesting in the US, where in the first half of this year, 2025, investments in AI stuff accounted for 50% of economic growth. Growth that is not coming from the AI companies themselves, but is primarily connected to the construction of the ginormous data centers that are being built everywhere in the US at the moment. Otherwise, it is a business where, as I said, it is not at all clear how money is supposed to be made with it. But let's just assume that even if the bubble bursts soon, everything will settle down a bit afterwards, and at least some of the investments will have been worthwhile. After the dot-com bubble burst, admittedly a much smaller bubble, currently around 1/5 of the AI bubble, the internet did not become history, but actually took off and became very profitable, albeit in a very flawed way, as described before. The AGI paradox. The only reason that makes sense why so much money is being poured into the idea of AI, apart from speculation randomness of course, is that this technology would replace jobs on an unimaginable scale. There is simply no other way to recoup the sums that are currently being invested. It can't be done through advertising, subscriptions or anything else. But if it is true that so much labor is being replaced, to a substantial degree, then capitalism, which is based on people working for money that they then spend again, will no longer function. See the money cycle in capitalism at the beginning. Here, the hypercapitalism we are currently experiencing would shoot itself in the foot. I will come back to how realistic I think this is in a moment, but first I want to stay with the idea. If the goal of AGI, artificial general intelligence, which all the tech companies are currently working on or proclaiming to have created it soon, is to replace human labor to a large extent, then, according to Marx, this non-human labor no longer creates any surplus value, which would lead to a collapse of the capitalist logic of exploitation. He himself foresaw this in relation to industrialization in Maschinenfragment from 1858. The theft of other people's working time, on which present wealth is based, appears a miserable foundation compared with that newly developed by large-scale industry itself. As soon as labor in its immediate form ceases to be the great source of wealth, it ceases and must cease to be the measure of working time, and therefore the exchange value, of use value. But how realistic is this idea of AGI replacing all, or at least a substantial amount of human labor? The main focus of tech companies at the moment is large language models, LLMs, which are fascinating constructs in themselves, but still very limited in their capabilities. Ironically, the place where they already have a measurable impact on the labor market, apart from filling the internet and academic papers with slop, is the tech sector, as LLMs are actually very good at writing working program code. Here, people are being laid off on a large scale and, especially in entry-level jobs, are not being hired. This is likely to cause a big problem for these companies in the future. People in entry-level jobs become more and more qualified over the course of their lives. And these more highly qualified people will then be missing in the future. What can also be observed is that even now, in the countries to which the West has outsourced coding, the use of LLMs that are good at coding is massively higher than anywhere else. Here, workers are still paid low wages, but they already have AIs working for them. The other quite useful use case for LLMs, besides programming, is to have ChatGPT write an email to an official body. This does not require any creativity and is an extremely annoying task for a human being, and in the end, it harms no one, except the environment. However, if the recipient then also has this letter read by an AI and has the reply letter generated by an AI, or automatically forwards the tasks resulting from the letter, the generated text is therefore only read and processed by machines in the end. From here you can quickly come to the conclusion that LLMs are only an interim solution and ultimately not the right solution for the problem at all, but that you could simply automate the entire process, and then you wouldn't need pointless text generation processes in the middle of the process. But nevertheless, that would be an example of debureaucratization, which would make life less stressful for everyone, but would of course cost jobs. The same applies to everything that involves formal language. Legal texts, lawyers' letters, tax returns, etc. will certainly be replaced by some kind of computer program in the long run, and in some cases already have been, but there will be more efficient solutions for this than large language models, which are already prone to errors, and, due to their structure, always will be. LLMs can be also useful if they have built-in tool callers, meaning that they can trigger another task based on a command. This could be a program, but also forwarding a caller to the right place in the call center. That's, by the way, another job that is slowly being replaced by AI, call center workers. However, as mentioned before, LLMs quickly reach their limits in terms of effectiveness, especially when AI is expected to take over a substantial part of the entire workforce. As a result, some companies have already turned away from LLMs and are working on so-called world models, such as arguably the most important company in the AI bubble, Nvidia, or Yann LeCun, who recently left Facebook as chief AI scientist and wants to develop a world model with his new startup. And this is where it gets really exciting, because we are entering the realm of the real material world, where machines are supposed to be able to act and interact. There are already autonomous cars that work fascinatingly well. Another job that is being replaced, taxi drivers. But with robots more complex than a ton of steel moving on asphalt, development seems to be more difficult, although it is also underway. The most famous example is Boston Dynamics, which, by the way, Google sold to SoftBank in 2017 because of its potential military applications. Yeah, the don't be evil days. Today, Korean car manufacturer Hyundai owns the majority of Boston Dynamics, for which their humanoid robot named Atlas is now supposed to start to work in Hyundai's factories as human replacements. But today there are plenty of companies developing robots of different kinds that are already impressively capable. But here, who knows, such a world model could trigger a new revolution that could disrupt the material world of work beyond white-collar work. That said, a lot of industries are already automated to an extent that you could ask if the maximum of automation hasn't already been reached. But what I want to say is that if artificial intelligence is going to transform the world of work, it probably won't be chatbots, but other approaches to machine learning. So goodbye ChatGPT, I guess. UBI, Unconditional Basic Income. But since we are already engaging in highly speculative thinking at the end of this film, let's stick with the fixed idea that AGI will replace virtually all work, even if that seems more like a Silicon Valley fantasy today. As pointed out before, jobs falling away could be a good way to equilibrate other jobs that are needed and can't be cut away, but are under massive exploitative conditions today. And who knows, maybe this is already the solution. Most people have an unexploitative job, and those who don't get unemployment benefits. But, firstly, if there are huge industries that don't create surplus value, a lot of redistribution of money to those industries without human workforce would happen, and that can't end well. Then we would again have two parallel worlds where money works differently, but now on an even bigger scale. And secondly, what if this equilibration of workforce wouldn't even out completely? What if there would be a massive part, or even the majority of the population without a paid job, because there are not enough needed jobs anymore? Here another tool comes into play, which deals with jobs disappearing and at the same time would help abolish exploitation, which in strange forms I will come to in a second is also quite popular in Silicon Valley. An unconditional basic income, UBI. And, as a general safeguard for everyone, and also to prevent exploitation, there should be some form of basic income for everyone in this post-capitalist world. I don't want to go too deep into that. There are different concepts how a UBI could work, and I think we can only find out what the best concept would be if we try some stuff out and figure it out that way. One form that surely isn't the right one though is the following. It shouldn't be something like Sam Altman's WorldCoin. a private UBI in the form of cryptocurrency that you will potentially receive in the future if you have your iris scanned at his company World. As I said at the beginning, money should be organized democratically by the state. If control of money is in the hands of a multi-billionaire, we are back to feudalism. And the UBI should be literally unconditional. If it gets conditional in some form, and it does in some of the concepts I saw, it becomes difficult very quickly. Also, if you replace all social spendings with an unconditional basic income, we would be in a neoliberal nightmare. But yeah, it has to be figured out somehow. Conclusion. My conclusion of all this is: we have to close the gaps between those parallel worlds, the immaterial world and the material world, where the cost of production is massively different. The two worlds of industrial capitalism and finance capitalism, where the value of money is radically unequal. The parallel worlds of the rich and the poor, both globally and locally. And to close these gaps, we can't just introduce a UBI and everything is fine. We have to go to the sources, and it might sound crazy today, because the stock market is such a normal part of our world. But we need to abolish finance capitalism. This construct that is redistributing all the money into a parallel fake world is, next to the general greed of neoliberal politics, one major problem why even the richest countries in the world have eroding infrastructure, and following that, stagnating economies, depressed people, far-right politics, and so on. And of course, stating the obvious, we need to start taxing the rich again. And also talk about expropriation of the extreme wealth of the few that they could gather in those unregulated times, which is wealth that has zero justification to exist. And expropriation maybe sounds super radical for some people, but a functioning inheritance tax already would do a lot to prevent a new aristocracy in the next hundreds of years. And of course, if we don't want to have a complete societal collapse, housing has to be completely rethought. The feudal structures of the housing market have to be broken in some form. Again, I don't have, and maybe no one has, the perfect solution for that. But I think we can figure it out. And the advertising-driven internet also maybe should be reconfigured, so that journalism could function again, and people are being connected again, and don't use social media only for brain rot entertainment. Freedom was always the basis of Enlightenment thinking. Individual freedom that goes so far until it touches another person's freedom. For me, that's the basis on what an ideal system should be built on. Universally. And that ideal of course never existed, also not in the free West, because our freedom was always based on reducing the freedom of other people, locally and globally. But even this freedom gets smaller and smaller, because the rich elite is touching the freedom of all of us. They destroy our world, our planet, our democracies, our press, our education, control us, surveil us, make us stupid, want to force us to keep the system running by exploiting us and let us exploit ourselves, own us. And the so-called liberals are part of that mechanism, which is why they don't deserve that name. We have a bipolarity of conservatives, far-rights, libertarians and neo-fascists on the one side, and those liberals on the other, who both are fighting against our freedom in their way. The first group wants to establish a new system that completely makes us all unfree, and the second group restricts our freedom more and more to keep the system we are in somehow alive, which leads to a feedback loop between those groups that in the end leads to a state of fascism or something similar, where we all are just functioning beings, being there to serve the few lords, oligarchs, dictators, or whatever they will be. And, as a last word, also because of the climate disaster we are facing, we can't continue with the system we are having right now. We are now living in a new age, and I don't believe it will be possible to simply rewind time. We have to deal with this new reality in the best way we can. And, as a last word, we can see today that things are possible, even if in very absurd ways. What a time to be alive. And maybe one day money will be something different to today's idea of money. Another world is possible, please don't forget that.